Made in Mexico takes on a new meaning for many Chinese companies which want to sell American consumers everything from furniture to electronics. Hello, I'm Arnold Naidu and this is The Heat. In the wake of global supply chain issues during the pandemic and the ongoing trade war between the United States and China, many Chinese companies are adjusting their delivery strategies. Chinese businesses are establishing factories in northern Mexico to produce and deliver products to the United States in less time and to avoid tariffs. CGTN's Frank Contreras traveled to the Mexican industrial city of Monterrey, where Chinese firms are on the fast track to compete in North America.
A tectonic shift is underway in the North American economy. It's moving global supply chains from Asia back to this region. Since the mid-1990s, the northern Mexican city of Monterrey has been an industrial powerhouse. U.S. companies have long dominated investments here. Now, Chinese companies are showing their robust manufacturing presence. The latest example of Chinese business expansion in Mexico is the 850-hectare Hafusan Industrial Park. The fast-paced installation of Chinese factories is part of a massive transition in the global economy, where these companies are moving production here to the northern Mexican state of Nuevo Leon and bringing their products closer to the world's largest market, the United States. Hafusan Industrial Park will house dozens of Chinese companies, including Kuka Home, which makes home furniture, and Hisense, a major Chinese-owned producer of home appliances and electronics. The main advantage of manufacturing in this part of Mexico is a huge decrease in delivery times. It used to take 10 weeks or more to ship from China. Now, companies can deliver products from here in 4 weeks or less. And that's drawing foreign investors to the state of Nuevo Leon. Since October 2021, Mexico's economy ministry says some $7 billion have poured into the state. Simon Huang is a Chinese executive with vast experience in building a successful manufacturing base here.
I think it's forever, because the world is always change. But if you want to avoid the supply chain risk, I think more and more Chinese companies, they want to go outside, and they want to be international.
By producing in Mexico, Chinese companies can ship their products into the United States with no tariffs, saving millions of dollars per month. Professor Jose Cornejo heads the Department of Economics at the University of Monterrey.
I think more Chinese companies will come in the future, but we must remember one crucial point. In the end, China and Mexico are very different geographically, and our cultures are also very different. So it's a matter of getting to know each other and learning.
Chinese investors say they will continue seeking locations in Mexico to build more industrial parks and factories. They point to this growing industrial city as an example of what the future holds for investors here. Frank Contreras, CGTN, Monterrey, Mexico.
For more, let's bring in our panel. Joining us now from Mexico City is Pola Grijalva. She's the president of the China Chamber of Commerce Mexico and senior partner with the World Trade and Investment Group. Also in Mexico City, Rafael Bernal is a staff writer for the Washington-based political newspaper The Hill. From Portland, Oregon, Liang is an endowed chair of economics at Willamette University. And from Beijing, Andy Mock is a senior research fellow with the Center for China and Globalization. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Andy Mock, Chinese companies are establishing a footprint in northern Mexico, as we heard, investing billions of dollars. So the manufacturing is going to be very close to the market, which is the United States. It's a concept known as nearshoring. What does this mean for Chinese businesses, many of which we are fully aware are facing restrictions and sanctions from the United States?
Well, thanks for having me, Anand. I think clearly this is a very important response to the difficulties in the China-U.S. relationship that make it more difficult for Chinese businesses to sell into the U.S. market. But we also need to recognize that Mexico in and of itself is a very important market. It's something like 130 million people, which puts it number 3 in that part of the world, with enormous upside potential. And it can also serve as a base for the entire Latin American market as well. So I think clearly there are these kinds of market dynamics going on here. But perhaps just as importantly, I think this marks an evolution in China's development as well, in that it used to be just made in China because of low wages in China, but now we're actually seeing Chinese know-how and capital being exported and gaining footholds all around the world. And I think Mexico is a great example of that as well.
And Andy, listening to our reporter there, Frank Contreras, there would still appear to be concerns over supply chain issues. And of course, this type of nearshoring overcomes that, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. So we see this other trend globally as well. Speed to market is vitally important. We see this with fast fashion, but really any kind of product. The closer you can be to the market, the more quickly you can respond, the better. That's good for your customers. That's good for your business as well. So certainly this quote-unquote nearshoring, put aside any geopolitical aspects of it, but just makes good business sense.
Liang, 5 years ago, the United States imposed tariffs on Chinese goods. The Chinese responded in kind, and what happened after that was that the consumers saw higher prices, and it made companies less competitive. In fact, as one Chinese manufacturer put it, our main market is the United States. We don't want to lose that market. So looking at what's going on now with nearshoring, with Chinese companies moving to northern Mexico, I mean, how much of it is a game changer for Chinese companies?
Yeah, good to talk to you, Anand. So I think you're right. A lot of these geopolitical tensions and economic, sort of a trade war have, really stimulated Chinese investment in Mexico and bringing the production line to Mexico, and also to take advantage of the close proximity to economize on, transportation costs and so on. But I think it goes beyond that. And I agree with Andy that, Mexico is one of the 7 Latin American countries that, in fact, has the so-called comprehensive strategic partnerships with China. In other words, I think, when moving companies to Mexico, many of these Chinese businesses are not only just trying to gain that expediency and to be able to sell to the United States. That is definitely one of the major factors. As the tariff war has, made the exports from China to the United States very expensive and uncompetitive. But I think beyond that, I think there are many areas of cooperation, and China has invested, for example, heavily in lithium production in Mexico, and they are also, more than willing to invest in Mexico's, infrastructure, digital infrastructure, especially. So I think, there are many areas that, China and Mexico can cooperate. And in addition to that, Mexico is one of the countries that really advocate for, multilateralism, reforms on, the international institutions like the WTO. So in that sense, I think, there's really a lot of potentials for China and Mexico to cooperate.
Pola, Grijalva, great to have you with us. Welcome to the show. As we heard in our report there, the state of Nuevo Leon is the recipient of something like $7 billion. That's since 2021. It's the largest recipient after Mexico City. And there's something like 100 projects that have been green-lighted there in that state. What does this mean for Mexico, especially in terms of employment, and also remembering something that Andy reminded us of just a moment ago, and that is it's just not the U.S. market that we're talking about here. Mexico is also a very big market.
Yes, it is. So for Mexico, right now, we're living in a very interesting moment. In total, between 2021 and 2022, we had an increase of almost 30% in foreign direct investment. And the country also has been receiving the investment or the reinvestment of the companies that are already there. So this is also important to take into consideration because almost 40% of this total comes from the US. And many of these companies are looking to reallocate and to bring back their investment, especially in Asia and particularly in China. So we're receiving Chinese investment, but also US, Canadian, et cetera, even Japanese and Korean that are not only rethinking about Mexico, but expanding their operations. So China in total, I think that it's placed in the seventh place, after Japan and the United Kingdom. But the investment in the manufacturing industries are very, very important for the Chinese case. More than maybe 80% we should consider for this kind of investment. And specifically, we find electric, electronic, green energy, and automotive, the most important industries that are arriving into Mexico. Of course, Nuevo Leon is very, very important as a magnet to this investment because they have a very good infrastructure and connection to the US market. But also the central plateau of my country is offering very good opportunities because this is connected also with the Central American and Latin American market, which are also very important to be considered, as we also have a lot of agreements and a lot of arrangements that give all of our investors competitive advantage into these markets. And the Mexican market itself, it's growing at a pace that it's around 2 to 2.5% per annum.
Right. Rafael, in 2020, the NAFTA agreement, which incorporates the United States, Canada, and Mexico, it was renegotiated into the USMCA. And if we look, I mean, we've been talking about investments from China, but if we look at the investment from the United States automotive sector has invested pretty heavily in Mexico. So with now China entering the country, it seems like this is an all-round win for Mexico because you have the expertise, you have the availability of workers there. So what does this mean for Mexico?
Well, the goal of most Mexican presidents has been to diversify their political and economic and trade relationships around the world because the country is so dependent on trade and its political relationship to the United States. So it definitely is very welcoming of this sort of investment, especially from China right now that there's this sort of large power conflict. The Mexican president yesterday at his press conference, daily press conference, I was there, and he said it. He said, you know, the most important relationship for this country, bar none, is still going to be the United States, but he doesn't want to take sides in you know, with one great power. He mentioned China, Russia, and the United States, with one great power or another. So it does mean a benefit. The fact that we are now talking about Mexico's internal market is also beneficial because you're talking about more long-term investments. From the 60s to the early 90s, there was investment in manufacturing in Mexico, but it was very restricted and it didn't benefit the internal market. So when that investment went away very quickly and caused a lot of economic headaches here. So basically what Mexico is looking for is investment that can't flee the country quickly and that really makes a profit from being here.
So Rafael, when you say there was investment in the 90s, but it was very restrictive, what's changed now?
So from the 60s to the 90s, Mexico didn't allow imports. They had an import substitution program. So that's one of the elements that made it so that Mexican society was not integrated with these manufacturing plants. Another thing is they were restricted mostly to a border, to the U.S.-Mexico border for tax purposes, really, so that they could export their goods to the United States without tax purposes. Of course, that's not necessary now that since NAFTA and now with the USMCA, that's no longer necessary. But there are a series of factors that have made the internal market more attractive and that have made foreign investments more stable. And that's really over governments, over 3 different parties, governments that don't like each other. And in that side of trade policy, they behave similarly, if not identically.
Liang, this strategy of relocating manufacturing to Mexico so that it's closer to the market, it's not new, is it? I mean, Japan did this. The Japanese car manufacturers did this in the 1990s. South Korea's car manufacturers did that as well. What can you tell us about how the strategy works? And if it is being put in place to evade tariffs, would the United States retaliate?
Well, I don't think so. I don't think that the United States is going to retaliate simply because these imports are coming from Mexico. Now, we all know that the USMCA, that's a free trade agreement. But granted that, these exports from Mexico would have to have the regional content requirements for non-autos. That's depends on the method that you calculate, would be 50 or 60% the value added has to come from the region. But for automobiles, it has to be 75%. So I think, it works in some ways because it really helps to economize the transportation cost, right? Especially, for example, the furniture businesses. Now, some of the important, furniture makers are now moving their factories to Mexico. And so that helped to economize on the transportation costs, which skyrocketed during the pandemic. Now it has come back down, but still, I think there is advantage to be closer to the market, not only, for tariff reasons, but also for the other costs. The other reason is, some of these, more labor-intensive production in China now is becoming more and more expensive because the labor cost has gone up. So Mexico remains to be competitive. They have, rising productivity, but with relatively stagnant wages. So in a sense, I think that is also to the advantage of moving some supply chain to Mexico. Not to mention, this diversifying, supply chain is also beneficial to China. But I think, again, we need to look at this beyond just a simple, economizing on the costs or, trying to evade tariffs. I think, again, like I mentioned earlier, there's a lot of, division of labor. There's also a lot of economic benefits for countries to, sort of cooperate together, even if there's no these artificial, right, political barriers.
Andy Mock, looking more broadly at the relationship between China and Mexico, it's been a very close relationship. In fact, the 2 countries commemorated or celebrated the 50th anniversary of diplomatic ties in 2022. The relationship is strategic. It's also a very close economic and trade relationship. And how vital is this for China, and where do you see it going?
Well, Nan, I'd like to start with this idea that what is different in what China is doing today versus, say, Japan back in the 90s, and that we have to recognize one of the greatest challenges facing Mexico. Well, there's 2. The first one is highly unequal development. So in the northern part of the country, living standards are not too different from that of the United States. But as you travel south, I think in the southern part of the country, per capita GDP is something like $7,000. The second big challenge is infrastructure. So if you took Mexico and you were able to flatten it, it actually would be about the size of Asia. And one of the historical challenges for development and more equal development in Mexico has been the lack of infrastructure. So I think this is something that is unique that China brings to the table, not just capital, not just commercial know-how, but actually expertise in capital and infrastructure. So this is something that I think is a win-win for both China and Mexico. And what's very, very interesting here is that Mexico has, in its way, suffered a century of humiliation like China did with the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, where Mexico lost more than half of its territory in an expansionist a war of aggression against it launched by the United States. So, we see Mexico becoming, the central government becoming stronger, development taking off. That certainly can have, I think, very, very interesting repercussions on the North American continent.
Pola, on the question of infrastructure development in Mexico, the point that Andy raises there. Now, Mexico is not part of China's Belt and Road Initiative, but China is involved in a number of infrastructure construction projects in the country. In fact, one of the projects that's involved in it is called the Maya train project. It's a 1,500-kilometer train project. So what can you tell us about how deeply China is involved in addressing this infrastructure issue in Mexico?
I think that it's just starting, but the capacity of China to enter this kind of industry is really impressive. So we can foresee that in the future, their participation could be as big as Mexico allows it to be, or as Mexico is ready to open the possibility to these companies. And this is important to mention because Mexico is destined to become the most important trade and industrial partner for China. Why? Because Mexico is the most industrialized member of the Latin American market. So we need to enhance our links both by sea and by land. And to do this, definitely, we need to partner with very strong, not only financial arms, but also delivering and technology partners to make it happen. The second reason is that our preferential access to the North American region that houses the biggest market in the world is also a very important asset when we can consider Mexico as the key factor to retain the competitive position of every industry. And number three, because Mexico has been ready and open to direct investment for many centuries. So now our capabilities in terms of soft and hard capabilities can be definitely a very important factor to consider for the Chinese reallocation. Why we speak about reassuring and not relocation? Because we're thinking of the access to the markets, and to retain that infrastructure is the key factor.
Rafael, Tesla has just announced that it's planning to build one of its so-called gigafactories in Mexico. In fact, that factory is going to be built in Monterrey. This is what Samuel Garcia, the governor of the state of Nuevo Leon, had to say about that. Let's watch.
What they have told us is that they are trying to do everything in an express way, turbo, so that in January and February of next year, they can start production. So we are talking about a year, more or less. At least in the first segment, there are $5 billion. In the application, they say there will be a minimum of 7,000 direct jobs.
So, Rafael, this is pretty massive, isn't it? Because Mexico already manufactures automobiles, and it's a big manufacturer of automobile parts as well. But here we're talking about electric vehicles. So how is that going to change Mexico's manufacturing base when it comes to automobiles, as well as its technological base?
Well, there is that concern that maybe Mexico's manufacturing base is tied to that older technology of using gasoline to power cars. Obviously, we also know that it's still a very broad majority of cars sold worldwide are still gasoline powered or fossil fuel powered, I should say. So that's not going to change very quickly. But Mexico does have that concern of, if we stick to the old technology, we're going to get beat. Our automobile industry will go away. And in Samuel Garcia, you notice there's also a political aspect to this. There are elections, presidential elections coming up in 2024 in Mexico, as well as the United States. And the governor of Nuevo Leon, although he belongs to a smaller party, his name is in the mix. He's not a likely winner of the presidency, but his name is in the mix. So there is the interest to sort of upend other governors whose name might also be in the mix.
Liang, of course, Mexico is just one of many, many countries that China is investing in. I mean, if we look at the Belt and Road Initiative, there's about 2/3 of the countries that are in the South American and Caribbean that are members of that initiative. Why is this region so attractive for China?
Well, I think, China's strategy is really trying to build that connectivity around the world. So I think definitely Latin American countries are important nodes of that global connectivity. But, as you mentioned earlier, that, Mexico is not part of the BRI countries, which I think is a shame. According to the OECD, Mexico is facing an infrastructure gap of close to $1 trillion in the next 10 years. And so I think it's very important for, Mexico to partner with China to build and rebuild infrastructure, and not only just the hardware, but also, the digital infrastructure. As, Mexico is so important, in upgrading its industrial competitiveness, they need that digital infrastructure, and also in their agricultural and rural development. So I think there's a huge role for Mexico to continue to work with China in that regard. By the way, Brazil is not part of the official, BRI countries as well, but Brazil has, received $66 billion from China in the past 10 years. And so that is tremendously helpful. So I think, in a way, there's, like I said, huge potential for China and Mexico to work on areas like energy, like infrastructure, like health, and also manufacturing, of course. So yeah, I think, it's definitely, there's a pressure for Mexico to work with China as in the backyard of the United States, but I don't think Mexico should play a, submissive role. It needs to do something in its own interest. And a stable and prosperous Mexico is definitely also good for the United States, right, when it comes to trade or immigration issues.
Okay, Andy Mock, I've just got about a minute left, and I must address the talks that are taking place in Washington right now on the debt ceiling. These are crucial talks. If the United States defaults on its debts, what kind of impact is this going to have, not just on the trade and economic relationship with China, but on the global economy?
Well, no one really knows, because U.S. Treasuries really are the cornerstone and the lifeblood of the global financial system. So I know that major banks have set up war rooms to be prepared, that this could be catastrophic, but certainly even coming this close to a default certainly is not good for American prestige or confidence in the American financial system and even the political system. So I think we will see repercussions from this.
Okay, and that's where we have to leave it. Thanks to all of you for being on the show. That's all the time we have. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C.